Welcome to the Conflict Consortium virtual workshop. We are convened to discuss diffusion of collective action in authoritarian regimes, the June 1953 East German uprising, Charles Crabtree, Holger Kern, Steven Pfaff. Hopefully I did not destroy the last name. So we are at this. I think this is section or session 36. We've done 150 people, 100 different institutions, thousands of people served. And Zach's getting us started.
All right, thanks, Christian. Everyone can hear me? We're good? All right. So I found this to be a really interesting paper, super sophisticated already and about ready to send off. And it was really exciting to see an understudied conflict period brought into the quantitative conflict literature. So that was really one of the best innovations of the whole paper, really. So I'll focus, on theory and empirics briefly, and I've been told I have 5 minutes, so I'll go a bit quickly and just get some ideas out there. So my main concern with the theory is that there was no discussion of the alternative hypothesis, the relational hypothesis, in the setup of the paper. It's discussed in the abstract and the introduction, and then we are left with the mass media explanations of collective action, but no mention is made of what these relational theories of collective action would entail. That is eventually addressed much later on in the paper, and I'll talk about that in just a second as well. But I would like to in terms of the alternative hypothesis, you should explain to me exactly where the radio signal did and didn't reach, and how that might not have varied with protest intensity, for example, and that would suggest that there is something else going on. You might want to give me some intuitive reasons why it's the social networks that matter in certain kinds of countries or regime types, and not mass media. And like I suggested already, you allude to these reasons, the relational hypothesis, but you don't address it until much later in the paper. So I was going through the paper this whole time and trying to figure out what you were testing, where the meat was for the relational hypothesis, and then eventually you get to that much later on in the paper. I think it was even after the initial empirical results, maybe. So I would first suggest moving that up to the theory section, because that is really theory, and that'll give you a much stronger basis. It'll give the reader a much stronger basis for understanding the rest of the paper. But then I have to admit, I didn't find the discussion you provided about the relational hypothesis very convincing, because it all focused on within town diffusion of protest, people speaking about the march that's going on in their city, but you're telling a story about the spread of protest nationally. And there's plenty of literature, theoretical literature, you could draw on to talk about subnational spread of protest, and then you need to give me some sort of qualitative discussion about that, the spread of protest, the temporal spread of protest in East Germany in this period. In terms of your modeling, I was just really concerned that there's way too much going on. You have dozens of models plus dozens of variables plus fixed effects in the models, and then with clustered standard errors, it's quite possible that your lack of result is because of a lack of data and too many parameters, and not actually a lack of finding for the mass media hypothesis. And I'm concerned that there is actually an effect for mass media, because I'm not convinced that there is an effect for the social networks as the paper claims. So first off, it's of course intuitive. We think that mass media is going to spread information that would lead to protest. When these protests happen so quickly, it seems it was basically a 36-hour period, I find it difficult to believe off the bat that it's spreading along communication channels, along people talking, interpersonal communication, people talking to each other. And then I didn't find your empirical test for the social network component convincing. So I understand, of course, it's super difficult, and I don't have a better estimation strategy, but using was this distance from Berlin and the railroad connections, I think those proxy for so many other things that it's not believable that people are traveling on these trains to spread information about protest. Maybe your argument is that people are calling each other, and these railroad networks proxy for these social connections, but then you need some discussion of that, which wasn't there. So I wasn't necessarily convinced by your null result on the radio, and I wasn't convinced by your operationalization of the social network. One other thought I had was that you could just run a model that has district fixed effects in your treatment and no other covariates, and see if that changes things. I wonder what would happen if you bifurcated the treatment variable. I never like it when you have a continuous treatment variable and then a dichotomous outcome variable, because it's not really clear where the action is moving, and then we're very sensitive to where we dichotomize. And I know that's pretty standard practice, but I'd at least like to see a robustness check like that. And then, of course, if you dichotomize the treatment and then you have a dichotomous outcome variable, you really just have 4 bins, and you can do some pretty simple difference of means tests that I would find convincing on a first pass. But that said, even if you do all that, what you have at the end of the day is a classification problem, and I feel like the tests you have to put out right away are just machine learning models. And I saw that eventually you do that. That's one of your robustness checks. You use a random forest. I find that to be a much more intuitive way to present these data and to understand these data. So I would just suggest actually leading with the random forest or another classifier that you prefer, and then using traditional regressions as the robustness check. So with that, I'll turn it over to the floor.
Holger, response? You are muted. You are muted.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, so these are good points. Let me just say 2 things. So one thing, if you look at the bivariate relationship between signal strength and the probability of protest, you see a relationship that is positive. But as soon as you include fixed effects for municipality size, you knock out that relationship. So it doesn't take, you don't need to control for a lot to basically remove the bivariate correlation between signal strength and protest. So if we don't, so the fact that we don't find anything is not because we're controlling for too much stuff. And then the second thing, so we try to dichotomize the treatment variable. The problem is that it's not clear where the cutoff should be. There's no good way of getting at it empirically. And so somewhere in the appendix, we basically locate the cutoff basically at any, at I think 50 different points or something like that. And you basically see that overall, that doesn't really change the findings. You basically get null results for most of those cutoffs, and then some produce positive estimates, some produce negative estimates. But basically doing that doesn't change the null finding. And that's it from me so far.
Okay, we'll open it up. Pauline, unmute. Yes.
Thanks. Yes. I thought this was a really interesting paper, Holger. I'm really psyched to be a part of this conversation. So I think my initial reactions very much reflect Zach's comments. I think that I would like to. So I guess I have one question, and then maybe I'll just touch on one specific comment. So my question is. I just wanted to hear what you guys had in mind in terms of testing for these second-order diffusion effects. I'm assuming that you are planning on including them in the paper, because I do think that they are really important. And I think that they could, in particular, be modeled using social network analysis, depending on what your, I wasn't exactly clear on what your data looked like. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, if that's kind of what you were intending, or what you were intending for those second-order diffusion tests. And then I was particularly interested in knowing whether you'd considered interaction effects. So, for example, the interaction of the media variable and the relational diffusion as you currently have it operationalized by distance. Because to me, I think that would, that would make sense. Maybe at a certain phase in this particular campaign, whether it's the pre-mobilization phase or the mobilization phase or post-mobilization, media might be playing a certain role, a lesser or a bigger role, depending on the phase, and might actually, be facilitating the relational diffusion mechanism. So, just wondering if you'd consider that, if that's something that you could potentially include, and also I had questions with respect to the effect of state repressive actions on the actual diffusion mechanism. So how might particular police or military actions at a very disaggregated level affect the diffusion as well? So I'll stop there and leave it open.
Should I respond or? Yeah. So we haven't really thought about state repression because that is plausibly post-treatment, right? Because that is conditional on mobilization, which we think might be conditional on media, and so controlling for repression wouldn't be appropriate because it's post-treatment. We've looked at the interaction between signal strength and distance. We don't find any evidence for that. The problem, though, is that we have limited power to detect any interaction because for most of a large chunk of the municipalities, distance to Berlin and signal strength are going to be highly correlated. As you go away from Berlin, signal strength declines, distance increases. We have some power to look at the interaction because we have this one transmitter in the south, which then flips the relationship between distance and signal strength. As you go further south, distance increases, but signal strength suddenly starts to increase again. But to the extent that we have power to look at that relationship, we did not find any interaction effect between distance and signal strength. So the story that one could be a substitute for the other doesn't really, I mean, to the extent that we can test it, doesn't really seem to hold up. And then in terms of relational diffusion or second-order diffusion, so our thinking at the moment is to downplay the relational diffusion story and to mostly focus on the null finding. And the reason for media effects. And the reason is that the feedback we got from several people is that they basically are not impressed with the evidence we have for relational diffusion. The evidence is very indirect. There's better work in sociology out there on relational diffusion using better measures. And so arguably we can't really make strong claims with respect to relational diffusion. And so maybe it's worthwhile to downplay that and to focus on the null result for media effects. The drawback of that, of course, is that we basically have a paper that reports null finding, which is not as sexy as having a paper that actually has something positive to say. So we're in this, and yeah, I would love to hear what you think about this, but we don't, at this point, we're not entirely sure whether we should downplay relational diffusion or whether we should make this a bigger part of the paper, but then run the risk that people say, okay, like Zach, I'm not convinced by this evidence. This is not convincing.
Zach with it too.
Yeah. So your CPS paper, which is newspaper or television, is basically a null finding, and then you have the survey on top of it, which kind of gives us some more purchase that might sexually give you not a null finding. But you had some qualitative discussion in this current paper about relational diffusion, and I'm scrolling right now, so I can't tell you exactly where. But anyway, the point is, I remember you trying to get qualitative evidence to support your claim, and I found some of that qualitative evidence more convincing than others. But I personally, as a reviewer, would not find that off-putting. If I saw a paper that had a quantitative null finding and then strong archival or memoir or secondary-based evidence to support your alternative hypothesis, I think I would be fine. I also would support just a null finding. I think we need more null findings. So.
I think Pauline had a 2, but one finger was cut off. Is that a 2? Yes, thank you. Okay, go ahead.
No, yeah, since I'm the one who asked the question, I think I totally agree with Zach. I think this is an important null finding, and I think that I would, if you can focus on the importance of the null finding even more in your paper, and maybe fess up to the fact that your relational diffusion mechanism is not really parsed out in a way that would make it a particularly important finding for this paper. I think maybe that would add value as well.
Will, you had a 1.
Yeah. So this falls under the category of half-baked thought in a mind that's a bit addled with a cold. So, so there's. And what I've been trying to think about, Holger, is take advantage of your notion that that the villages network model sketched by Siegel is a plausible process for what spatial for what the diffusion would look like, and think about and trying to think about how you might continue to push that argument to try to figure out what would what is there some way that you could set that up as opposed to a strictly random process, right? So and that's where that's the half part that's baked, and the rest of it I just got nothing. But that struck me as a potential direction if it has any legs, and it doesn't in my head yet. So I just wanted to throw it out there to the group in case that sparks any useful thinking to anyone. What I'm trying to say is that if that's how the process works, and even though, I mean, the problem is you just can't observe the network, right? While I actually found the trains more plausible than Zach did, and would encourage you, if you're going to stick with those, to use the trains rather than Euclidean distance. In other words, switch what's in the paper and what's in the appendix. But I wonder if you could do some thinking about what those patterns, what clustered patterns could plausibly look like. It would have to be some sort of a simulation that you would, and again, I don't know that that's at all feasible, but that's as far as I could get with that thought. So I thought I'd toss it out there in case somebody can come up with something useful. I'll leave it at that.
I mean, we tried to do that a little bit with the spatial probit, and we didn't really have encouraging results. Ultimately, the problem with network analysis is that we don't observe networks, and we also don't observe the process of diffusion. Right? We only observe whether municipalities had protest or not. We don't have any time dimension there, and that makes it really difficult to pin down any kind of diffusion. And those two things, there's nothing to really get around that. So in our mind, that ultimately severely limits the story we can tell about relational diffusion. I don't see us being able to get certainly better quantitative evidence for diffusion, and in terms of the qualitative evidence, what we've found so far is maybe suggestive, but it's certainly not more than that. And so we're not really comfortable with the diffusion story as it is right now, because we realize that it's suggestive, but not more than that. So
I'm up next. I'm going to continue to kind of like drill down on the point. So for me, the kind of the information story juxtaposed against networks, right? So I know why you pitched it in that particular orientation, but if you were to go to average social movement person and ask them about how do things diffuse, they'd probably say networks anyway, right? So I think there's this other element. So kind of the opposite of maybe what someone was suggesting before. I think maybe Pauline arguing that you need to play it up a little bit more. I was kind of caught by how much it was played up, and that no one would have bought that. And so part of it would be distance has to proxy then for something, and trying to figure out and drill down to what that is. I was similarly taken with the train thing, right? And it seems like I wish the null finding orientation would kind of work and think that and would think through that it's possible to get that thing published, acknowledging that. But I'm hard pressed for one that I think was good at doing so in a decent venue where I think this could come out. And so if you do try to bolster up the kind of the radio did it narrative, then there needs to be some attention given to. I think you try to strike the balance, and I guess I want the balance more equitable on the thing that you can't really measure. But in line with that, right? Maybe there's something about so implied within your argument is this kind of like, so how do authoritarian governments kind of like how do they undergo these assaults, and where do they come from so quickly? I was always like taken by Verta work about like abeyance structures, right? I'm just like, well, just because you can't see the overt manifestation of an organization doesn't mean there isn't something there. And you kind of hinted that with the social network. And so I'm kind of uncomfortable with it, but if you're thinking of how do you identify abeyance structures, and is there anything that provides any kind of indication whatsoever of what civil society is structured like that is unearthed even later to give you some indication of like where that comes forward, that will be kind of problematic in a different way. But then I began to kind of wonder about that. Related to that was this issue of I don't know who the source is that you cite or where they got their information from about the protests, but I was like, you gave me a date, and I'm like, who the heck is this? And so I'm just imagining that they got it from some media, right? I was like, they got it from media, or they got it from experts, and I'm just like, either one then becomes this issue of, okay, so localities could be left out because they weren't reported, or localities could have been left out because the network of communication didn't extend to these locations. So I'm like, if you're going to have to run with that data source, then I'm going to need to know a little bit more about where that came from and disassociate that from the other networking story that you're trying to get at. Because let's just say it's right? And so then as you radiate from Berlin, it kind of like cascades out across space. And I'm like, okay, that could be somewhat plausible, and that suggests some mechanism of emulation. And then the trains and the communication then radiates in that similar way. And I'm just like, wait, no one had any family members that was 4 towns away? I mean, so that becomes like one mechanism of communication. And so you either lay that story out for us and show that familial relations were geographically distributed that way, communication lines were, migration. You either get us to that radiation story through something else, or you really have to start worrying about this kind of mechanism of diffusion about information about the protest that you're using and suggesting that that's independent from the things that you're trying to examine. Zach had a 2 on this point. Unmute.
Sorry. All right. In terms of the possibility of familial networks diffusing information, I wondered if the census data are detailed enough, and if names are distributed in such a way in East Germany that you could build a spatial network based on the composition of names distributed across cities, right? So if there are certain names primarily associated with like Southeast Germany, and then you see some in Berlin, like that suggests a connection. If that'd be feasible, I'd be convinced that suggests some underlying social network.
Pauline, 2.
Yeah, related to this point, another potential way of measuring these, essentially, I think what we're all talking about are these like latent network trends, which you can measure using social network analysis, obviously, depending on your data again. But you kind of touch on the importance of this concept of organizational embeddedness, right? Because like the workplace was important in diffusion. So I don't know if like data on small worker organizations could also be an avenue of probing this network a little bit more.
And Michael wanted to jump in as well.
Yeah, just 2 points on the social networks. First of all, the whole population must have been completely muddled up, and with the refugee flows of the Second World War. I mean, this must be a very unusual circumstance, even in 1953. I mean, the whole population must have been, people moving from East Prussia, East Twisk, people. I mean, I would imagine that this was a very unusual situation of very mixed up social networks. The second point is that trade union organization, given that it was carpenter strikes. I mean, I know the trade unions are obviously controlled by the Communist Party, but still there must have been some grassroots shop stewards types who had communications with people, from the annual meeting of the trade union. So I wonder about the trade union, the formal organizational links to the trade unions.
Actually, I have two on all this because now it's like this cascade effect. Okay, so what Michael made me think of is if everything was all jacked up and the traditional mechanism of social networking was completely effed up because all these other things were going on concurrently, then that actually supports a diffusion kind of like radiation story, because that mechanism of communication and radiation would then be plausible given that the other mechanisms of communication and networks and so forth would be highly, highly jacked up. I'm not sure that Michael was going there, but I was just thinking about that. I'm just going, if all these other mechanisms of communication were disrupted, then maybe that one then kind of sounds a lot more plausible. So for me, in the kind of like Rwanda case, like ethnic identification was largely a function of kind of like local identification. You knew who was in your village, but when everyone starts moving around, then that mechanism of identification is completely broken down, and then other things have to kick in. And so similarly to that, if you have all these kind of like migration and all these other things going on, then the kind of radiation story then becomes, I think, a little bit more plausible. Just a minute. Okay. Oh yeah. Do you want to respond to the series of the series of twos?
So I like how you turned around the concern about relations into an argument for why distance works as it does. So I think maybe we can work with that. The census, the names, I don't think we can get name frequencies from the East German census. We probably could get them from something like telephone books, but that would be a lot of work to kind of like try to count the names, the frequencies. I also doubt that you see a lot of variation across East Germany in that, because East Germany, remember, is a small country, right? It's as big as some U.S. states. And so you don't have as much heterogeneity as you would have in bigger countries. My reading of the literature suggests that the organizations that existed, labor unions and things like that, did not really organize the uprising. Certainly not at a nationwide scale. So there's no evidence that I can think of that suggests that diffusion operated through local branches of the trade union or something like that. That just doesn't seem to be what was happening. I think that's all. Oh, and then the source of the protest data. So this is I can't recall his name right now. So he's a historian, and he collected those data while doing archival research on the uprising. So it's mostly not based on newspaper reports. It's mostly based on archival data, police reports, and things like that. So I don't think we have the and then secondary sources. So I don't think we have the usual problem, the problem that our protest data are primarily coded from newspaper reports. That's not the case. It's mostly primary sources.
Okay, that's a different type of problem. I'm not. You're not alleviated, because I'm kind of like, which primary sources? Who did he speak to? Where did he get this stuff from? So I think we need something. But Heidi.
Yeah. So I'm going to shift the conversation a little bit. So I'm I was not at all familiar with these radio signaling, signal modeling stuff before this, and I imagine many people reading it would not be. So I wanted to know a little bit more about that in terms of the accuracy. I mean, to what extent can we take this as accurate to what the signal strength actually would be? I imagine that there is some way that is measured, like in cases where they do know the actual signal strength, and then how well do these models predict that when it is known? So if you can give me something about that, that would be, that would be really helpful. And then also maybe related to that, like if there was any archival or primary sources that would, where people talked about like listening, maybe not even necessarily for this particular campaign or these protests, but in that period, if there's any way to corroborate with archival stuff, like when people talk about, this being something that they listened to versus in other areas they didn't. I don't know if there's any way to triangulate that or corroborate that, so that to really show that there were gaps in the areas that you think that there are gaps in the reception of the radio program. I think that would be helpful.
Holger?
I mean, so I don't have the so there were a couple of public opinions surveys done in the early 50s or late 40s that were surveys done by basically surveys of East Germans traveling to West Germany or West Berlin, which was still possible right after the war. And so in those surveys, they were asked about all kinds of things, including their radio listening habits. And I don't have the subject level data, but in those surveys, it's very apparent that in certain regions of East Germany, people listened to RIAs a lot, and in other regions, they said that they couldn't listen to RIAs because they couldn't pick up the signal. So I think the claim that certain regions of East Germany had access to RIAs in '53 and other regions didn't, I think that strikes me as pretty uncontroversial. I mean, that is widely accepted. And RIAs itself knew that it could not, that its transmissions could not be received in some parts of East Germany, which is why going forward in time they built additional and stronger transmitters. So in terms of benchmarking the signal propagation model, so we've done this for '89, for the East German uprising in '89. We used the same model for television signal strength, and that seems to track what we know about areas of East Germany that had access to West German television in '89 and areas that did not. And some of that information does come from on-the-ground measurements of signal strength. So we probably can cite that earlier research that suggests that those models do a reasonable job of capturing signal strength in East Germany, and there's plenty of evidence that those models seem to work reasonably well overall. That's why they have been used in many different contexts over the years. So I'm not too worried about the accuracy of the signal propagation model.
Great.
Michael, I added 2 on this radio thing. Are you on that?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you say in the paper that 70% of the population were listening to this radio. But if 70% are listening, then that suggests there's very few areas that are out of signal, because some people aren't listening because they're die-hard communists. Some people just don't like listening to radio news. They're more interested in other things. Some people don't have radios. So that seems like, at least within every city, you must have a large number of people listening. Now, if you can show that those 30% were clustered in particular pockets, like in the south, it seems to be in the Saxony, that you have those big cities that you don't have protests. But I would like you to look, I mean, I like your model. I think it's very sophisticated and very convincing, but I'd just like to have a little bit more. I mean, it was just really jarring to see that 70% of the entire population were listening to these radio signals. So I think having a paragraph a bit more on that to justify your signal strength. Because remember that just because it's a low-strength signal doesn't mean that somebody in the city with a more powerful radio transmitter or in a slightly better antenna couldn't get it, because you don't need to have 100% of the people in the city hearing the broadcast. All you need is 20 people. and they call their friends, or they talk to their friends in the cafe.
Actually, my two fits well with what Michael was just saying. My thing was kind of like, it's kind of clear you don't really believe in the radio thesis, and so I think you kind of overly undersell it, right? So I'm just kind of like, give me the mechanism. I mean, like, so it's like I'm sitting here, I hear the radio. From what I get of your radio broadcast too, it's kind of like, it's not like the radio said at Tuesday at 3 we should be there for blah blah blah. It was more like on Tuesday at 3 people were there. So I didn't really see how the radio broadcasts were facilitating mobilization. So you need to kind of like walk us through how that's working, because I'm just like, okay, yeah, I'm sitting at home. You've just told me about a summary of events. Okay, you told me about some events that are happening. So that is, I get the sense that protest is possible. The radio didn't mention the cops were showing up, so I'm just like, okay, that means protest is possible, and I'm less likely to kind of, so in a Quran-like sense, I'm like, okay, good, the revolution is now, let me go. Is that the mechanism? Because that wasn't completely played out well enough to kind of like clarify for me exactly why the radio did it. And so, did you want to respond, or we move to Cyrus?
Let me just respond to that. So yes, so that is the mechanism that we have in mind, and so we started this paper expecting to find evidence for that, because that case really seemed to be a case where if mass media are able to mobilize protests against an authoritarian regime, this should be the case where you should find it, for some of the reasons that we talk about in the paper. We were very surprised that we did not find it.
Okay, hold on. Along with what Michael was saying, though, it's like, but the mechanism of communication, right? So it's like, when you hear a radio broadcast, and then you're no longer in front of the radio, right? So it's like, what else goes on? What else happens? And what are other people doing? Because does your neighbor need to listen to the radio broadcast because you just told them? I mean, how do other forms of communication factor in there? And so that element of it, that dynamism, wasn't exactly clear. But clearly you need to work with the cases, because when I was like reading your extractions of kind of like summarizations of what the radio was communicating, I was like, this seems all after the fact. How is that helping? It seemed more like a summary of things that happened, and you're just kind of, okay, now you're going to be forward thinking based on the past. So it just kind of wasn't that wasn't clear. Like, could you geocode the radio broadcast, right? So like the radio was talking about location X, and then you see protests in location Y.
It only talks about very few locations, mostly Berlin. But I mean, for the most part, the content of the RIAS broadcasts was so there wasn't a long time lag between events happening in East Germany and what was broadcast on RIAS. So it's not that RIAS reported 2 days later. They might report like two hours later or something like that. And so I think our sense is that if you listen to RIAS on those 2 days, you got a pretty good sense that first protests are erupting in Berlin, then the next day protests are erupting all over the country, and there would have been enough time to then say, okay, you know, they're revolting in those 10 cities. We should do something as well here. I mean, that's kind of the idea. But you're right that we are not looking at communication between radio listeners and maybe people who didn't have access to RIAS and who then were also motivated to go out and protest.
Cyrus, welcome, by the way.
Thanks, and really sorry about the timing snafu. So, I mean, the gross effect of, I think the gross effect of the RIS signal, like against a counterfactual of there being no RIS signal, is going to be really, really hard thing to identify in this case for lots of reasons. And so I'm also wondering if there are ways that you can get at more subtle types of measures and hypotheses. I thought Christian's suggestion maybe about locations in the broadcasts could be interesting and something to think about. The reason that I think it's really hard to identify is, I mean, first of all, like, there's got to be some error, presumably, in the measure, and I wonder if there are studies that help to tell us what the magnitude of that error is and what the implications would be then for the type of attenuation bias you'd get in your estimates, and whether or not that attenuation bias is going to swamp anything we could reasonably expect to pick up, right? And then the second thing is that, I mean, insofar as you're proposing this alternative explanation of alternative modes of communication, then you have a problem in defining what are treated areas and what are control areas effectively, because if it's the case that you only need to have, like what was pointed out, a few people treated by the radio, but then that information propagates, then you have a sort of interference situation where you don't really have, people who aren't assigned to radio aren't necessarily absent of the information that the radio is going to be providing. And so I think in order to gain traction on that, you'd actually need to get into the finer grained temporal dynamics. I have a couple other points, but I think these relate to things that have already been put on the table, and so I can bring the other ones up later.
So let me push back on that. So we don't have temporal variation, or we don't observe it, so there's nothing we can do about that. In terms of also what Christian said earlier, so yes, so there might be some cities in which signal strength was, or municipalities in which signal strength was relatively low, and so very few people might have been able to pick up the radio signal. So it's true that there might be some people in each municipality that were able to pick up the signal, and they might have talked to their neighbors. That's fair enough, but you would still think that there should be some difference in having 5 people in a large city being able to listen to that, and most people in a city listening to the broadcasts. So that should still reflect, that should still produce some kind of difference in their conditional probability of protesting. So.
But I mean, it depends on how that that diffusion and mobilization process accumulates over 5 days, right?
Well, it's one day. It's 1 day, really, right? So you wouldn't think that having 5 people in a large city listening to the broadcast would be enough. And then talking to their neighbors would have the same effect as 100,000 people listening to the broadcast.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what helps us here is that this happened within 36 hours. It's hard to imagine that few people listening to broadcasts and then talking to lots of neighbors would have the same effect as lots of people listening to the broadcasts to begin with. But it's true. I mean, this is an observational study, so the comparison here is not going to be super clean. Although I do think that there are areas in East Germany that did not have access to RIAS. Even if you had a big antenna and you lived on a hilltop, you would not have been able to pick up the signal in sufficient quality.
You're reflecting? Okay. I never know if it's a reflective pause or.
Go ahead.
My 2 on that was kind of like, do you have any pre-event radio information? So this is like one broadcast, right? And then you're kind of intrigued in kind of like how they're keeping people up to date. But I was wondering, are there any other broadcasts that have taken place before that give some sense of not listenership, but some degree of? Are there any other radio broadcasts that you believe might have had any influence on the relevant population to set up this kind of subsequent use of the radio? I mean, I'm really interested in how is the radio used, right? And maybe this is some qualitative stuff like Zach was trying to suggest to get some idea of how the radio is used in everybody's life, how this is weighted against other forms of information, and I guess maybe that's more of a contextualization issue. So let's move that on. Will, you're up next. Oh, sorry. Zach, were you a 2 or a 1? Okay, Will, go ahead.
So I may have just missed it, Holger, but it seems important to your argument that the East German press did not cover this, that in effect there was a blackout of any information, which is highly plausible, but if it was in there, I missed it. So either, and of course if that wasn't true, then that raises a whole other. So that is true. The East German press did not report any of these events. Okay, cool.
Well, let me clarify. So, I mean, we're talking primarily about East German radio, right? Because newspapers would not have been fast enough.
Yes.
So East German radio did not cover the beginnings of the protest. Once the Soviet forces declared martial law, that announcement was broadcast over.
Oh, sure.
East German radio. Yeah.
Okay. And then, would I be correct that in 1953 in East Germany that the primary alternative to face-to-face communication would be telephones?
Yes.
Would that be
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And so we haven't talked about that. Obviously you could have trunk line data in principle, though that ought to just be proxied by population. So I don't imagine, although I don't know, I guess I shouldn't assume. Is there any potential information to be leveraged by telephones, or is there some reason to believe that the Stasi had penetrated? I'm going to guess the answer to this is no, that the Stasi had not penetrated East German society to the point that it would by the mid-60s, that people would, have good sense to never get on the telephone. Can you comment at all about, what information about the telephone communications system is available, and is there reason to think that people would have actually spoken over the phone?
So I think, we had a footnote in the paper at some point, but I can't find it anymore, so it might not have survived the latest edits. Few households had telephones. Some had, but not a lot. It was not common. We don't have, I think we have the exact numbers, I just can't find them anymore. I think it was something like 200,000 telephone connections in a country of 5 million households, something like that. So
have you checked and made sure they're not where the protests were?
We only have the national level data. We don't have them at the disaggregate level, which is something that we were trying to find, but those data haven't survived. So we know that few households had telephones, but we can't get a disaggregate level data for that. So.
Okay, I may come back to that.
Okay, I added 2 on this, which was so I was like early at the kind of like once the Stasi archives came out and like tried to go in, and the index was horrible, and I'm like, it'll take decades for this thing to be decent, so I like left it and just kind of stepped away. But I was curious. So there's a bunch of information about alleged informants in there, right? And I'm just like wondering, has that been geocoded yet? Because I'm wondering about the locations that the informant concentration is low. Might be, maybe that's the place where the protest kicked off, which would be freaking phenomenal. But I'm like, that's all dependent upon whether or not the informant, because I know there's a lot of accusations of people being informants, and I think that's in there somehow. I don't know how it would be extracted because of the index system that I saw, but maybe that is possible, because that would be one way of getting at a network that's really cool.
So I have Stasi informer data at the county level, but not for that time period. The Stasi, for the most part, in '53, the Stasi was very small. It was a very small organization. It was basically built up in reaction to the uprising. So informers would not have played a big role, or the role they played later on in '53, because the Stasi was not that massive secret surveillance organization that it became later in the '60s and '70s. So I don't have data on Stasi agents or informers for the '50s. But
you could, I mean, for different paper, right? But you could look at how protests led to informant networks subsequently. Presumably, the protest kicked off on a spot. You want some informers in there. So in the U.S., they had this thing called the Ghetto Informer Program, where basically they were just like, okay, who are all these black protesters? We need to have someone in the ghetto to inform us of what's going on. So then they created the Ghetto Informant Program to basically get blacks in bookstores and barbershops to basically inform on what was going on in the black community. Will, you had it too?
Yeah, I'm now thinking about the phones may have been much more installed in businesses, and so I'm wondering, is there some reason to think that trade unions may have had phones, and that you can actually leverage? Again, I can't imagine you currently have this information, but might it be worth trying to look and see, what kind of trade unions actually had telephones, if you could, use phone books and see, whether or not those happen to be located in the cities where you were much more likely to have protests.
I mean, I would assume that all trade union offices had telephones, so presumably we might be able to get a location of trade union offices. Yeah, I mean, that's something we could do, but my guess is they are probably either located in all county seats,
Okay.
which we already
Okay.
control for. We already have a dummy for that, or they would be located in the district capitals. So I don't think it really gets us variation beyond the variation we already have in the data.
Okay.
Yeah.
Zach, you're up.
Yeah, so my question is basically done at this point because I was going to ask about the phone communication network. But seeing Will's question in response to that, like, just really has me wondering what you think the actual relational mechanism is. If so radio diffusion mechanism even, right? If it's not radio, it's not television, and it's not phones, but we still seem to see some temporal heterogeneity in the diffusion. I'm just curious if you have some intuitive ideas of what was spreading the protests.
I mean, my sense is that the protest was, I think it was undoubtedly relational diffusion, through telephones, through neighbors. The problem is that we don't have a good handle on any of the channels of diffusion because we don't really observe any of those. But I think it's clear that it was relational diffusion. It's just that we don't know how to really tap into it beyond the distance measures. That's the main problem, I think.
Cyrus.
So this is a new point. So looking at the map on page 45, I mean, there seems to be a lot of action going on. I guess it's a little bit difficult to read the map because of the population sizing of the dots. Like, is it necessarily like useful information in terms of interpreting like how important that area is for studying the pattern of interest? So, but I mean, anyway, it does seem like there's a lot of green, at least relative to the blue, although it's kind of hard to discern, sort of toward the west. Is that right, or is it just the population size that? Because when I first look at the map, I see a lot of green stuff happening in areas that would seem to be reachable via West German media potentially, and I'm wondering if that's if there's a media story there, so it's not just the RAS that was affecting the dynamics, but there could have been exposure to other sorts of media as well, in which case maybe the analysis should be limited to things that are more on the eastern side of the country. So you're at least estimating the effect for the population of interest. That would be those who aren't receiving alternative sources of coverage. So I mean, have you looked at it by sort of segmenting the analysis?
So we haven't done that. What we do is we have this more general signal strength measure, which also incorporates the most popular West German radio station in East Germany. And so the idea is to say, okay, could that have, is it possible that people were motivated to protest not because of RIA's broadcasts, but because of the content of that other station? And we still don't find a relationship between signal strength.
So that's in the control set that you're using, or is that what you're saying?
No, it's just a different signal strength measure, which is the so I mean, the results are in the online appendix or in the appendix, and it's page 52 where we have a combined RIA's NWDR signal strength, which combines the signal strength of RIA's and of the it's the maximum of the RIA's signal strength and the NWDR signal strength, and NWDR was the most popular West German station in East Germany.
Okay.
So that suggests that that's not. I mean, we still don't have a result for that. We could easily partition the sample as another check. That would be easily. We could easily do that.
Because I mean, because the thought was that you might be getting lots of zero, not much action going on because there's sort of saturation, and so okay, there's no effect there, that's fine, but it's not really an interesting subpopulation to be looking at if we focus on the areas where there would be no alternative media channels, like on the eastern side. I wonder.
We could easily do that. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Michael, you do too.
Yeah, I mean the map is amazing because it suggests that just about all the big cities had in protest within 24 hours or 36 hours, which is quite amazing. I'm not sure I can think of any comparable example, but there is that exception which I'm sure is driving the spatial results. Is it Freiburg in the south there in Saxony? There's a cluster of big blue cities, but that's the only large cities that haven't protested. So it seems like that's whatever's happening or not happening, I should say, in those particular few cities is what must be driving the result, I assume. So therefore, we want to know what's there's something peculiar going on. Maybe it's just a big Soviet military base there. I don't know. Where the soldiers can come out more quickly, but I think that seeing that you have just about all the large cities protesting, I mean, I'd like to see, a breakdown in your dependent variable we were discussing earlier about the sources, but also just the actual characteristics of the dependent variable a little more, because I think that it's driven by the lack of happenings in a few cities around that big city in Saxony.
That's a good question. I don't have a good answer. So this is Karl Marxstadt or Chemnitz now. Yeah. But I don't have a good answer. I don't know why this is the only district capital that did not see protests. I don't know. So, but that's a good question.
Cyrus, you too.
Yeah, I'm wondering. So I know you have. Let's see, population size. That's in your control set? But I'm wondering, like, if that needs to be taken into population size needs to be taken into account in the analysis in other ways as well, just considering the fact that there seems to be something different going on with the large cities as compared to the small cities. I guess somehow just if people are just sort of flipping a coin as to whether or not to protest, you'd expect, like, by your indicator of there being any protest at all, the large cities to have a higher likelihood of protesting, right? Just because you're aggregating more coin flips and you're more likely to get ahead. So if you restrict the analysis to smaller places where it might be more surprising that any protest activity would take place, what kinds of things do you see?
So, okay, two things. So if you look at page 57, so that gives you the fraction of municipalities with protests as a function of municipality size class.
Mm-hmm.
So we control for those size classes. The population size that you see in the other tables is county level. This here is at the municipality level. So you do see the pattern that larger municipalities are more likely to have protests, and once you reach a certain size, you basically are guaranteed to have a protest.
Mm-hmm.
So that is true, but we control for that at a municipality size, and then in addition we control for the county population density and population size.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it's entirely true, yes. So larger places are more likely to have protests.
Yeah.
That's true.
Pauline?
I had a small point, totally unrelated to what we were just discussing, about framing. You kind of start off the discussion couching, your study in the role of not only media but also social media in protest diffusion, and then you bring it back a little bit at the end. You mentioned that, arguably social media was important in the Iranian protests in 2009, I think, and then you say, but arguably it hasn't been important in spreading, protests later, like in the Arab Spring or whatever else you were referring to, which I think there has been, some pretty important. There have been some pretty important studies to that effect, actually. But the media that the RIA signals and the social media today that we're talking about are two very different things. And social media is in and of itself today a very relational thing. Things like Twitter and Facebook are all based on relationships. So I think maybe setting your particular media your particular type of media apart from social media is important in this like framing issue and couching your study. But also maybe, you know, what implications does your study perhaps have for the role of, you know, how we view social media, if any? You know, can you relate your study to the importance or non-importance of social media as well?
So yeah, so that's a good point. So we've struggled for a long time. The problem is that everybody is focused on social media right now, and very few people are interested in mass media, like traditional broadcast media. And so we were struggling to make the paper relevant. But I think you're right that our discussion of social media right now is just not good. And so I think we're going to flip that argument around and say that social media, and you're right, there are some recent studies that I think cleanly show that social media can moderate collective action. And so I think the argument is to flip this around and say, well, we see the evidence we find no evidence for traditional broadcast media. We find relational diffusion, and that is consistent with the recent work on social media, because that is essentially also relational diffusion. So I think that makes much more sense than what we have right now. Yeah, but we struggle with the distinction between social media and broadcast media. Yeah. So.
Actually, so my one follows well off of Pauline's, but my initial response is kind of like, relevance is not what we do, right? Come on, give me a break. Put out a blog post, man. We can't. We're working on a different timeline. By the time this comes out, it might not be relevant. So I'm not even sure if reviewers. I wish reviewers attempted to get the relevance thing in there, but so I'd be less concerned about that. But related to that is kind of this overall framing of the piece. So this kind of makes it a 1 as opposed to the 2. So it's kind of like, so a couple things threw me off, right? It's just like we kind of had case before theory. And it's weird because a bunch of people do that now. It's like, so you have the introductory section, and then you have, here's the case. And then you kind of get to, okay, theoretically, here's how you address it. As opposed to, and maybe, you know, Will check me if this is a senior moment, but I'm kind of used to like, you know, here's some theory. Okay, now let me explain the case, and now let's go to the data. Because I think that framing is really important, because I'm like, okay, so shall I read this as a comparative case study person, and kind of like you're going to get me into the weeds, or kind of like what Pauline was alluding to, okay, of what is this an instance, right? Where it's just like, okay, so how shall I navigate and connect this to a broader theoretical literature? Because that kind of caught me, because if that is the case, then you have a bunch of independent variables. So I understand why you collected them, and I do the same thing, right? So all of us that do the spatially disaggregated stuff, we do the same thing, which is we grab from the independent variables that we have available at that time in that place. That becomes our model. And we never compare it to, okay, so if we were going from the state-of-the-art research, these are the independent variables that we would have to have. And we never have that conversation of, here's the variables that are standard. So it's kind of like, you know, you hint at it, right? Political opportunity structure, mobilizing structure, cultural frame. There'd be some variable that kind of comes from each of those little packets, and then we can get down further to be those individual level explanations of attitudinal stuff. Those are, if you had your druthers, right, you'd have that the constellation of variables you have. You didn't have all of those. What you did have is a bunch of independent variables that leave out some stuff that I'd kind of go. So you're not gonna be surprised, but I was like Pauline, I was like, prior repression, and so I'm like, okay, prior repression has no effect on subsequent mobilization. All right, just shoot me now. Just end my career, stick the gun in my mouth, pull the trigger, because you just said all my stuff was irrelevant. But then I'm like, no civil society data, no police data, no media coverage or penetration. And I'm just kind of like, so there's a bunch of things that aren't there, and I'm just kind of like, I think we would generally expect them to be there, so not mentioning it is, maybe just a footnote. It's like, okay, so this is what we don't have, but we wish we did. I kind of want that, like, you know, mea culpa type of statement. And maybe that's just wrong, but for me it was a framing issue, because then this becomes about, this is the data that are available at this time, and I realize this isn't where the literature is, but go with me in that this is what we had.
Okay, let me push back a little bit on this. So yes, I mean you're right about the variables we have, the variables we don't have. On the other hand, we are not interested in I mean, we're approaching this as a causal inference project, so we're not interested in estimating the independent effect of all of these variables on the probability of protest, prior repression or whatever. What we need to hold is that basically conditional on whatever covariates we have, fixed effects, etc., it's plausible to assume that anything that is not observed is no longer systematically related to either the signal strength or to the outcome variable. Right, so we're not trying to build a comprehensive model where we look at 10 or 15 different factors that pertain to different theories and to kind of like evaluate which factor is more important, which theory has more bite. The goal here is much more narrow. We're trying to estimate the causal effect of signal strength, and the covariates are in there because we think that it's more plausible that signal strength is as good as random once we condition on the other stuff.
I guess that's my thing, right? The minute you show me table 2, then I'm just like, I'm going to go to my list of variables that you've not paid attention to. I'm going along with the kind of causal inference dynamic, and I would be fine with that if you didn't show me table 2. If table 2 is not there, I'm just like, why would you use these variables instead of mobilizing structure? I think that mobilizing structure or some proxy for that or repression would be more important than any of these variables, given what the literature would generally say is going on. So this just throws me off because it makes me think about, okay, why is this here as opposed to other stuff?
Well, the reason why that stuff is here is because the reason why some municipalities had higher signal strength than others is basically geography, right? They're in a different place, and so we are concerned about the fact that certain parts of East Germany might be systematically different in terms of sociodemographics and some other stuff than others. So you could say, okay, well, we really need to condition on this force of the police size or previous repression or something like that in order to make ignorability hold. I mean, that's fair enough, but it strikes me as kind of a stretch to think that that would be systematically related to signal strength conditional on the stuff you're already conditioning on.
We could have that conversation, but but fine. I will. It is open, folks.
I had a couple of points.
Shoot, Cyrus.
Yeah. Okay. Just one really quick one, if I may, going back to the population size one. You don't have a table in here that shows us when you omit the large municipalities, right? You just have dropping the smaller municipalities.
I think that's probably true, but it doesn't matter which subset we drop. It doesn't change anything.
Okay, all right. So I just wanted to. So it would be good.
So you would prefer you want us to show what happens if you drop the largest municipalities?
Well, just show all the size classes. I would say would be nice. Just because for me it looks like there's something different going on with the big places and the small places. Maybe just looking at the map. It looks and so.
Well, that's true. But that is captured. Presumably, that's captured by the size class dummy. We can't estimate the models for the largest size classes because we don't have enough observations. We can drop the largest size classes. That's fine, but we can't do it size class by size class.
Okay, yeah, I think dropping the larger ones would be good because insofar as the people in the larger places are exposed to all sorts of things that might water down the effect of this, whereas in the smaller communities they're more isolated. So the potential for other types of things that might, basically create a ceiling effect sort of situation are lower and so on. Okay, so then I guess, so you do, it is a causal inference exercise, but you do introduce this alternative explanation. So you are doing, some comparative sort of like informal model comparison in a sense. And so I'm wondering, about how we should interpret these two results side by side. So, you could imagine a relational network serving as a mechanism through which information is transmitted, and the same types of dynamics, sort of information cascade dynamics or something operate, but it just happens to be operating through that network as opposed to through broadcast media. But that's kind of unsatisfying, right? It seems like, to the extent that you're saying that the transmissions and that unilateral type of information have no effect, that the relational network is providing the treatment, that is being administered via the relational network is somehow different. And I'm wondering if you could sort of develop that logically a little bit, right? So is it that the relational contacts provide more credible information that the unilateral information media, radio programs don't, or is there some other kind of facilitating resource that's being transmitted? So organizational know-how or something like that that's being transmitted. I think if you could develop that, I mean, there may be some other sorts of empirical implications that you can investigate. I don't know. It depends on the data that you have. I mean, the trains measure is interesting because it suggests that there might have been something about like interpersonal sort of contacts and communication of either more credible information or some other type of facilitating resource that was going on. I think you could probably do more to develop that a little bit. I think also developing this alternative explanation a little bit more in terms of what sorts of resources travel through a relational network that don't travel through unilateral media might also help you to address people who want some sort of comment on current social media or something like that. A hypothesis that would come from this is that, to the extent that social media is, the unilateral kind of transmissions that resemble radio signals, may not be, what's important about social media, but rather it is the relational aspect. So it allows you to actually say the study, okay, if a reviewer or something insists on that you have something to say from this study that would be relevant.
Yeah, all of that makes a lot of sense.
Zach.
Cool. So are people hearing an echo? I'm hearing an echo.
Okay, can everyone other than Zach mute?
All right, great. Two just presentation points in the paper that I found confusing. First off, footnote 20, where you discuss the placebo test, I frankly had no idea what was going on. So if you could just try to present that in more layman terms, I think that helped the reader. But then figure 1, so it's on page 44 in my copy of the PDF. This goes back to one of the very early comments made, which is that I don't really know how to interpret signal strength, because to me, when I just look at this immediately, what I see is that things are really strong in Berlin, and then they kind of look like they're equally strong everywhere else. There's lighter gray near the cities, and then there's this one beam coming from Hof just outside of Germany. So my immediate intuition is that there are just two levels of signal strength. And I'll accept that that's not true because I understand that things weaken over space and that you have a continuous variable. But I'm wondering if there's a more intuitive way to present this in addition to that, maybe. So, for example, you could show just the distribution of signal strength in each municipality. So, I don't know if it's a 0 to 1 variable or what, but do we just have a linear degradation with distance, or is it more of a step function? But something to give me a more intuitive understanding of the treatment variable than just the map, because I don't know how to read it except for white and then some gray. And then super nitpicky, I only see 2 transmitter locations, but I thought you said there were 4. So I either misread, in which case I'm sorry, or maybe in the note you could explain why there are only 2 blue dots.
Holger.
Yeah, so the last point is easily clarified. So there are, and we probably have to change the wording. So there are 2 locations, but 4 transmitters.
Okay.
And 3 transmitters on the same location. So Berlin has 3 different transmitters.
Got it.
The map, yeah, so the map might be not as useful as it is now, and I need to think about whether we can make it more useful. I wasn't clear about, so you want to see some other graphical representation of the relationship between distance and signal strength?
No, so just like a density plot of signal strength. Just show me the distribution of signal strength in your data set.
Well, so one-dimensional, so univariate.
Yeah.
That is in the online appendix. So that is So that is figure A1, page 56. That's a histogram of signal strength.
Okay. Okay. I'm not. I have a different copy, but that's fine.
Oh, okay.
I see
All
it.
right.
Okay, I got it. Okay, cool. Yeah, I like that.
All right.
Michael.
Yes, first of all, just an earlier comment on, just to add to what Cyrus, or modify what I think Cyrus said a little while ago. The real problem with smaller places, if you want to focus on smaller places, which I think may have been the suggestion, is that people from a small place, which is right next to a big place, will go to the big place to protest because they go to the Communist Party headquarters or they meet with other people. So you can't just, I mean, I think smaller places are a little bit more trickier to model. You'd have to incorporate the fact that you may just be moving into the nearby bigger place. But the main point I wanted to raise, which hasn't been raised so far, is that, I mean, there's only two pieces of qualitative evidence in the paper, both of which actually don't support what you're saying. I would have imagined that, I mean, there are some people still alive today, but I would imagine after 1989, there would have been efflorescence of oral histories and lots of sort of local historians looking into this and other historians. So there must be a huge corpus of people saying, here's how I found out about it, here's how I got organized, here's why I went to the big protest in the central square. And even if it's, just 20 of those would be kind of helpful. I mean, because the two pieces of qualitative evidence you give, one of which it's not actually people's social relationships, it's just simply they came back from East Berlin to Dresden. I think they were visiting East Berlin and then they came back, or they were there for work and they came back the next day. So that's not a relational network. That seems to be a traveling for work. And the second one, if I remember rightly, is about what happened within East Berlin. So it's not actually about diffusion between one city and another. It's just how you get people involved in one city. So, I mean, just to give you a comparison, I mean, when my paper with Kenneth Andrews on this diffusion of sit-ins in the American South, we find a clear distinction in the qualitative evidence. When the people are talking about how they get organized for protest within the city, they're always talking about social relationships. They talk about, I got together with a guy in my dorm, I got together with a guy in youth with the chess club or whatever. But when it comes to diffusion across cities, it's always via radio or newspapers. So, I mean, that just emerged from perhaps we had maybe 25, 30 accounts. But, I mean, you must be able to get sort of comparable evidence. And I think that would make the story a lot more convincing for me.
So, okay, so let me ask the question that I asked at the beginning again. I mean, should we try to strengthen the relational diffusion story, even though I think we probably won't be able to convince many people that we have sufficient evidence to really make strong claims, or should we downplay it and focus on the media effect story and the null finding, and then basically just present relational diffusion as here's a plausibility, but that needs way more work to substantiate?
Okay, actually, to facilitate this, how about all those that want to see the piece on just the null finding, hand up. Nope, one. You got one. Okay, just saying. Okay, that's in answer to your question. Okay, so back to list. I want to rephrase my question. So it seems as if part of your piece reads as, how could challengers have pulled off rebellion in an authoritarian government? Now, answer one from the literature. The government's weak. You don't want to go there. I hear you, but okay. Answer two. The challengers are just good. Doesn't seem like you want to go there either. Answer three. Government versus challenger behavior tilted in the direction of favoring challengers. Doesn't seem like you want to go there. Fourth is technology kind of facilitated the resistance effort. Now, part of my problem is two out of the three or three out of the four involve some kind of government repressive kind of capability relative to challengers. You kind of want to bracket that and toss it into the fixed effect, which is all right, fine. Some people want to roll that way. I want that one back in there. But it seemed like in order to kind of get to the tech part, you need to find some way to dismiss and get rid of these other three in some way, shape, or form that is, I guess, plausible, right? Because you actually talk about you have a line where you kind of go, the authorities were surprised at the resistance kind of like emerging in this space, which seemed to be kind of like, okay, well, that an authoritarian government wasn't able to properly read its population. There's a bunch of people that study authoritarian governments that wouldn't be surprised at all by that statement. You don't seem to be surprised by that statement. And so there's some kind of miscommunication or some misallocation of power or perception that's there. And so if you do want to kind of frame it as a did technology do it type of thing, I think you need to kind of deal with these two very kind of like plausible rival explanations. Okay, it's really about the network, whether or not it's an abeyance structure or how it's kind of diffused over time and facilitated by this technology, or the government is just, if you had some proxy for like government repressive capability or prior government activity, if that would explain the distribution, and that didn't turn out to be the case, then that would be a little bit more convincing for me, and I don't think that's like proxied right now. But it seems like you have a couple of those things going on within the piece, and maybe my take on it was in that you were a little bit more inclusive about trying to hint at some of these other things and not just definitively go like, okay, look, there's this claim out there about technology, and we have a way to kind of investigate this, and there's a couple of plausible explanations, rival explanations. We're not going to deal with this. We're testing this particular claim, right? If you're stronger on that, then I'd be a little bit more comfortable than the encompassing, more pluralistic way you're viewing it right now, hinting at these other things, but then in the end kind of denying us. I couldn't tell if people were like unsettled or listening, or there were some twos, there was some movement. Y'all are fidgety because we're at the end, or you're good. There was no twos, right? Okay. Do you have any response, and then kind of actually let you have it and let you ask us the question if you want.
No, I mean, so the final question that I had was the question about, play up the relational story or play it down. And then I guess another question would be, should we send this to a sociology journal or political science? So half of you are sociologists, so that's a good audience to ask that question.
Okay, Michael has a 2, and then I have a 2 on your question. Pauline as well. Michael.
Yeah, the reason why I wasn't sure about, I think there's no evidence. I was very dissatisfied with the relational story because there's absolutely no evidence for it. All you've got is dissonance. But the problem, so the reason why I think it's nice to have a paper that just says, look, there's a really convincing, everybody accepts this explanation, we're going to disprove it. But then the problem is that really you just left this gigantic mystery. Here you have an entire country, protest spreading in a perhaps not totalitarian, but authoritarian regime within 24 hours across an entire country. We thought we knew why it was. It was because at least the news of the initial protest was spread by mass media. They're not. So now it's a complete mystery. And that's why, in some ways that you need to have some, at least gesture at an alternative account, right? Because otherwise it's just, wow, this is just incredible. This is the most amazing thing. Then how on earth did it happen? There's no telephones, and you're saying that there are no private telephones. It's not television. It's not Facebook. Then it's not trade unions. It's not there's no organizations involved in it. It's just like a gigantic mystery. I think without sort of filling in how it could have happened without radio, or with radio being not an important part of the story, is just kind of a gigantic question mark.
So it's everything but radio with Michael. Okay.
Well, nothing but radio, and nothing. It seems like there's no explanation, right? It's a mystery.
Pauline.
I think that a lot of what we've been saying, and this kind of builds on what Michael was just saying, and I brought this up at the beginning. Even though it's not coming out in your model for one reason or another, I feel like this interaction effect of both mechanisms of the importance of radio perhaps at the beginning, or perhaps even after in later phases, and this relational like person to person mechanism. I think that the two are working together somehow. So I don't know why that's not coming out in your model. Maybe you could play with that. I think that, yeah, I don't know. I'd leave that up to you to figure out. And I just wanted to point you to, are you familiar with Nils Metternich's and some others piece that came out in JCR in like 2013 on protests in Thailand. It's basically a social network analysis approach to understanding, modeling why protest is actually not happening when you would expect it to, and they use this this network level approach and measure network level effects that I don't think that you have the data to do it, but it might give you ideas in terms of framing, because they do this like case before theory thing as well, and then just taking moving more towards a social network analysis approach to it.
Holger, did you want to respond? Because you asked the second question, which was, okay, so by hands, how many think he should go for a political science journal? Soch? Heidi, where are you? Yeah, okay. Majority said political science. Now, so you want to follow up with a question on that, or you're good with the straw poll voting thing?
I think I'm good. I'm good with the responses. I think that was extremely helpful. Thank you so much to all of you. We clearly have some more work to do.
Good on the direction though, and actually there's many parts of it that I think are like very powerful, but also intricately connected with various things that different parts of the community are doing with, which is why I think it's also good to kind of have it in this venue and hopefully be seen by a bunch of other people, because I think a lot of us are trying to kind of work through similar problems at the same time. Will, you wanna take us out, or how are you feeling?
Yeah, just want to thank everybody for participating, especially thank you to our discussants. When Chris and I started this, we weren't sure that people would be willing to set aside the time to read everything, spend an hour and a half being on video and everything. So we really appreciate it. Without you, and you get nothing from it. So we just want to thank you guys for jumping in and participating. Encourage you to let others. We'll this is the last one for this semester. We'll be putting out a call in June probably over the summer for the fall. So if you know ABDs or assistant professors in any field doing interesting work that you think might benefit from workshopping, please share the call with them.
Thank you so much.
All right, great.
Everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
very much.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.